So we have, on the one hand, I mean, I think it's really interesting. We have a lot of people. I mean, I think of Ian Duncan Smith and certain people who stand up in Parliament and say China is a real threat, whether it's through diplomacy, whether it's through retail, whether it's through whatever it is. Other people go, don't be so ridiculous, don't be so ridiculous. And then this extraordinary story this week about actually somebody. What's the guy's name again? I got it wrong yesterday. Is it Yang Tembo, isn't it? But somebody called him Chris when he came on. This extraordinary human being who looked like something out of a Johnny English film, who seemed to have ingratiated himself with prime ministers and royalty and everything. I had an espionage expert on yesterday. He said this happens all the time. There's nothing to worry about. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that your assessment of his spying skills, such as they are, is probably right. Less James Bond, more Austin Powers, I think, in the way that he's approached things, not least because he boasted about all of his achievements on the Chinese internet. One of the reasons that we couldn't understand why there was this bizarre anonymity order. You only needed rudimentary Mandarin and 5 minutes on the Chinese internet to find this guy splashed all over these sites talking about this constellation of stars he'd managed to gather around himself. Well, look, no, it's a very serious thing because he's a part of a behemoth of an organization called the United Front Work Department, which exists to try to make host nations receptive to the Chinese Communist Party and to control Chinese diaspora. And there are about, I mean, at least 40,000 members of this thing. This guy wasn't a lone wolf, and there are many, many others like him, and we should be focused on how to deal with that threat, not solely focused on this guy, although I have to say his penetration of the royal family and senior levels in government is worrying and quite surprising.
Well, I was going to put to you a theory that somebody, and I'm nearly 60, Luke, I know I don't look it, but one tends to forget what one's had for breakfast, let alone what one said yesterday. But one of my guests yesterday intimated, and there's no way one would be sympathetic towards the Duke of York, whose choice of friends is akin to, I've no idea. I mean, honestly, Jeffrey Epstein, you know, Ghislaine Maxwell, and now this sort of Johnny English figure. However, a lot of people were saying yesterday that this could go a lot deeper. And the High Court made the decision to release his name. It was going to be released in Parliament anyway, but that actually it suited the establishment, maybe senior figures in government, political figures, business, whatever, to sort of hang Prince Andrew out to dry, you know, already tarnished goods, if you like. But that actually what's even more worrying is this could go a lot deeper. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it certainly does, in the sense that this guy wasn't alone. So the United Front Work Department has been doing this kind of work for well over a decade and having considerable success. So I'm pretty sure now, as a result of this story, and thanks Prince Andrew, thank you very much, for enabling a lot of this to come out. As a result of this story, we're going to hear a lot more about the activities of the United Front Work Department and its influence operations in the United Kingdom. That's something, Jeremy, to underline. In 2023, the very influential Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament concluded that China had penetrated every sector of the UK economy. And they've done that principally through the United Front Work Department. So I'm going to keep repeating this thing because it's extremely important for people to understand. This is the overseas influence arm of Xi Jinping's Chinese Communist Party. It is trying to change the way our institutions function. It is trying to influence the way that we live our lives in Britain and to shape it. So that
give us some examples for people who hear stories like this and they go, what do you mean? Somebody told me once about an online company, Temu, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there are various, well, very large Chinese companies, but let's just look at penetration of the City of London, for example. You'll have loads of United Front Work Department people who are operating within various bodies of commerce who are exercising and exerting major economic leverage in order to get their own way. Wow. So you might have seen a headline the other day. We've been pushing for China to be labelled a threat and to be put in something called the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, just so we're actually able to force these people to register as potential agents on behalf of the Chinese state. And the lobbyists against that were banks. And why was that? because of the huge interests that have managed to accrue over a long period of time, egged on by members of the United Front Work Department and their influence within those institutions. This is a really serious problem and a very difficult one to get to grips with.
So the calls for Starmer to officially declare China a threat, led by you and others, but that seems to have fallen on deaf ears, despite the fact this gentleman has decided to screw pensioners, the armed forces, farmers, waspy women. Is this a weakness in terms of Starmer, do you believe?
I think it is a tremendous weakness. I've got to say, though, that it's also 180 degrees from where Labour was in opposition. They were very good on China in opposition. When we were pushing to try to amend the Trade Act to stop the UK from entering free trade agreements with countries like China, perpetrating a genocide in the northwest of the country against Uyghur Muslims, Labour was our biggest support. And it is really important to underline that concern about China is cross-party. Throughout the Labour Party, throughout every party, in fact, including the Lib Dems. But as soon as they got into government, we've just seen everything dropped. It's 180. They're pushing for a reset of relations with Beijing, and that is going to cause us very bad long-term headaches. It's going to make us more economically dependent. It's going to make us more exposed if there is escalation in cross-Taiwan Strait tensions, which there may well be, and it's going to divide us from our closest allies. Even the EU is slapping massive tariffs on China for electric vehicles.
So what is Starmer thinking? Why wouldn't he do what is patently obvious to everybody? I mean, Steve in East Yorkshire, I must just read this to you. He says, MI5 said that China has penetrated every sector of the UK economy. Given Starmer's refusal to add China to the foreign influence register, could this extend to the office of the Prime Minister? It's interesting, isn't it?
Well, I think that might be going some. But what I would say, I think, about where the government is currently, my view is that their entire programme of government is predicated on some economic success. They're going to have to get that economic success.
Yes.
And they believe that going cap in hand to Beijing is the way to deliver that. Now, for various reasons that might be a little bit too complicated to go into, there is a sort of dogma within the Treasury that China or bust, you know? If we don't hitch our economic wagon to China, we're not going to be able to make it. This is basically evidence-free, and the more you probe it, the more it falls apart. Like, for example, the fact that we run a nearly £40 billion trade deficit with China, or like the fact that all of the foreign direct investment into the UK, 80% of that is from state-owned enterprises in China. I mean, why do we think this is? Do we think it's because the Chinese state is benevolent to UK critical infrastructure, or because they're trying to capture it so they can leverage it in order to get their own way when it comes to their foreign policy? Well, we think the latter, and that walking headlong into that is willful blindness.
Really good to have you on, Luke. They're shouting at me that we're out of time, but